I moved into the old house on Willow Street because it was cheap. Too cheap, in hindsight. The real estate agent said it had been vacant for years, and the previous owners had left in a hurry. She didn't say why. The house itself was beautiful. A sprawling two-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a large backyard that bordered a dense forest. But there was one thing that made me uneasy from the start. The basement. The door to the basement was always locked. The agent said she didn't have the key, and the landlord claimed it was just storage, and not to worry about it. But the door was heavy, made of solid oak, with a thick, rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The first few weeks were fine. I settled in, unpacked my things, and tried to ignore the basement door. But then I started hearing the noises. It began with faint scratching sounds, like something was dragging itself across the concrete floor. At first, I thought it was rats. I set traps, but they never caught anything. The scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. Then came the footsteps. Late at night, when the house was silent, I'd hear them. Soft, deliberate steps coming from below. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, just beneath my feet. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sounds were too real to ignore. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and decided to break the lock. The padlock was stubborn, but after a few hard strikes, it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The air that rushed up was cold and damp, carrying a faint, earthy smell. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was larger than I expected, with a low ceiling and walls lined with shelves. But what stopped me in my tracks was the figure standing in the corner. It was a man. He was tall and thin, with matted hair and clothes that hung off his frame like rags. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and wild. In his hand, he held a rusty pipe, raised like a weapon. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then he lunged at me. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, the basement was empty. The man was gone, but the evidence of his presence was everywhere. The shelves were cluttered with empty food cans, dirty blankets, and other signs of someone living there. The police searched the house and the surrounding area. That's when they found it. A hidden passage in the forest behind the house. It was a narrow tunnel, overgrown with roots and vines, leading straight to the basement. The man had been using it to come and go. The police said he was likely a squatter who'd been living in the basement for years, unnoticed. They searched the forest but found no trace of him. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. But I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there, watching the house, waiting for the next person to move in. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that basement and the man who called it home, and I wonder if he ever found another place to hide. I never believed in black magic or rituals, not until I moved into that apartment. It was a small, run-down building on the edge of town, the kind of place you rent when you're desperate and broke. The landlord was a shady guy who barely looked me in the eye when he handed me the keys. "Don't mind the old lady next door," he said. "She's harmless." She lived in the apartment directly across from mine, and from the moment I moved in, I felt her eyes on me. She was in her late 70s, with thin gray hair that always looked unwashed, and a pair of glasses that magnified her pale, watery eyes. She'd sit by her window all day, staring out like a sentinel, and whenever I passed by, she'd give me this slow, unsettling smile. The first week was uneventful, but then things started to get strange. It began with the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint chanting coming from her apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Sometimes I'd hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor, followed by a low, guttural murmuring. I tried to ignore it, telling myself she was just an eccentric old woman. But then I noticed the pictures. One morning as I was leaving for work, I found a Polaroid taped to my door. It was a photo of me, taken from across the street, as I was unlocking my apartment the night before. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, but the hallway was empty. I tore the photo down and threw it away, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. The next day, there was another photo. This one was of me sleeping in my bed, taken through my window. My stomach churned. I checked the locks on my windows and drew the curtains, but the photos kept coming. Every morning, there was a new one. Me carrying groceries, me talking on the phone, me sitting at my desk. It was like she was always watching, always waiting. I confronted her once. I knocked on her door, holding one of the photos, and demanded to know what she was doing. She opened the door just a crack, her magnified eyes staring at me with that same eerie smile. "I'm just looking out for you, dear," she said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "You remind me so much of my son." Her son. That was the first time she mentioned him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that evening, I ran into one of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman who'd lived in the building for years. She told me the story. Mrs. Hargrove's son, Thomas, had died tragically when he was just 22. He'd been her only child, and she'd raised him alone after her husband left. Thomas was a bright, kind young man, but he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd. One night, he was found dead in an alley, the victim of a drug overdose. Mrs. Hargrove was never the same after that. She started getting into strange things, the neighbor said, lowering her voice. Rituals, black magic, all that stuff. She said she was trying to bring him back. People around here think she's crazy, but no one has the heart to kick her out. I felt a chill run down my spine. The chanting grew louder, more intense. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that someone was in my room. My plants began to wither, even though I watered them regularly. My food would spoil within hours, and my cat, a usually calm and friendly tabby, would hiss and hide under the bed for no reason. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to see what she was doing. I waited until the chanting started, then crept out into the hallway. Her door was slightly ajar, and a faint, flickering light spilled out. I peeked inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her apartment was filled with candles, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood. There were jars filled with dark liquid, feathers, and bones. And scattered across the floor were dozens of photos, all of me. That lady was kneeling in front of the altar, her hands raised, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Her voice was low and guttural, and as she chanted, she held up one of my photos and pressed it against the altar. But that wasn't the worst part. On the wall behind the altar was a large, framed photograph of a young man, Thomas. He looked eerily similar to me. Same hair, same build, even the same way of smiling. It was like looking at a distorted reflection of myself. I backed away, my heart pounding, and ran back to my apartment. I locked the door and sat in the corner, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the rent or the deposit. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching me. Sometimes, I'll find a Polaroid slipped under my door, or I'll wake up to the sound of faint chanting outside my window. I don't know what she did to me, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never feel safe again. I work at a university as a resident assistant on weekends. We usually work in teams of 3. 2 people walk through the building, and 1 person stays at the front desk to check people in. One time, while my coworker and I were walking on the 9th floor, talking to students and making sure everyone followed the residence hall rules, my coworker suddenly got a call on our work phone. Surprisingly, it was from our campus police. She answered the phone and heard a woman crying and begging for help. Before my coworker could say anything, the call ended. This was really scary because the woman's crying sounded so real. Unless it was a recording from a movie, I'm sure it was a real person in serious trouble and not a prank. The worst part is that we had gotten the same call a few months earlier, with the same people working at the same time on the same floor. With a team of over 60 people, it's almost impossible to work with the same 3 co-workers twice. At the start of our shift, I even joked that we'd get the same call again, and we did. After getting the call twice, we both thought they might have been accidentally redirected 911 calls, especially since the number on the caller ID was the actual police phone number. We called the non-emergency line and talked to a dispatcher, but he wasn't helpful. I don't blame him because it's such a strange situation. He took our names and said he'd report it. But what really creeped me out was when he said they hadn't received any calls that night, so nothing could have been accidentally redirected. Then I remembered something. Earlier in the school year, I had gotten a call from the same campus police number, but it was just my boss asking me to come to her office to help a student. When I got that call, I panicked because it showed the campus police caller ID. This was before the 2 calls with the woman crying. I told my boss about the caller ID being wrong, and she agreed it was weird, but she retired just weeks after that. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now I wonder if the call begging for help might have come from her office, which is now empty. My co-worker and I walked to the office hallway, which is connected to our building, and tried to get into her office, but it was locked. It's worth mentioning that both calls happened around 10:40 p.m., and it was completely dark outside with no one around, especially in the staff area. All the offices are off limits to the public, but there's one room that my co-worker and I had a key for. We opened the door and found an old phone inside. We used it to call our work phone, and sure enough, it rang as the campus police. Now we were really scared. We checked the rest of the building for anyone in trouble, but we didn't find anything. After that, we went our separate ways and finished our shift an hour after midnight. Now I'm just sitting here, trying to figure out what that poor woman was calling us for. Why did she hang up? Why did this happen twice under the exact same unlikely circumstances? Why did the caller ID show the police? This is getting long, but I'll add some important details. Our third co-worker is a man with a thick accent, so he couldn't have prank called us from the boss's phone and pretended to be a woman. The first call back in October was a woman crying and saying, "Please help." The second call, which my co-worker and I both heard, felt different, but was definitely a woman crying and begging. I'm in an area with a lot of human trafficking, and I feel a strange sadness and fear that this might be what I heard. I've worked here for 2 years, and am good friends with most of our team. No one else has experienced this except for us. I only have 2 possible theories. Either the call was a redirect from the police, and the dispatcher chose to hide his mistake, or someone snuck into my boss's office and called us begging for help. I'm writing this story partly because I'm too scared to sleep, and partly to see if anyone can think of a better explanation for the calls. This just recently happened to me at my local Walmart. I'm a 19-year-old female, and I was by myself, getting a few things later in the afternoon. I grabbed a cart and headed to the home and pharmacy section to find something. I stopped in the aisle with the protein bars to look for something specific. I had set my cart to the side. It wasn't crowded at Walmart, and no one was in the aisle at the moment. But then, a man approached me from the side and asked me something. I hadn't seen him before, and I didn't see him come into the store. He didn't have a cart or anything in his hands, and he was much taller than me, so I kept my distance. I'm always on guard, especially since I was alone. He asked me something, but I couldn't really hear him, so I just said, "Huh?" He repeated himself, and he had asked me if I was from a town about 45 minutes away from where we were. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I said, "No," and tried to walk away. Then he said, "You're very pretty." I awkwardly smiled and walked away again, clearly not wanting to talk and feeling extremely uncomfortable with the whole encounter. He then asked me if I was single. I said, "I'm not interested," very abruptly, and walked away as fast as I could. I knew something was suspicious, and I was worried if I ran into him again, he might try to keep talking to me. He didn't directly threaten me, but the context of me being alone and him saying I looked familiar, even though he approached me from the side, was really suspicious. After that, I went to the checkout, checking to see if he was nearby. But I saw him walking in the opposite direction, which was a relief. I then quickly got in my car, making sure I didn't see anyone. He could have been harmless, but my instincts and his body language raised a red flag for me.